Good morning. How are you? Yeah, thank you for that lovely introduction. Um, someone once said I was the grandfather of food policy, and that person is no longer with us. But thank you. It's very kind. It was great hearing the inspiring words from you, Commissioner. Thank you very much. I think you are a leader. It's clear, and you're lucky to have her working with you. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm so happy that you invited me. Looking forward to sharing the day with you. I have a workshop early this afternoon. I'll be signing books and selling books and all that stuff as well. So look forward to all kinds of opportunities to engage with you. I also have to say that I feel a little bit of trepidation because I've never been in a room with this many Minnesotans before in my life. And even though I know you have a reputation for being nice, fair, and of course above average, I was conducting some research for my talk and I came across this book called Famous Crimes of Minnesota. It's just out and I think you ought to check it out. And after looking at it, I almost canceled my flight here. But among other things, I was shocked to find that some of the biggest criminals of the 19th and 20th century spent time in Minnesota, including Jesse James, Bonnie and Clyde, and John Dillinger. St. Paul was apparently referred to as a criminal's paradise. You may know this. This may be something you all learned in grade school. I don't know, but I was shocked, frankly. The chief of police of St. Paul apparently had a deal with criminals that said, you'll be okay here, you'll be protected in St. Paul as long as you don't commit any crimes here in St. Paul. You can do whatever you want anywhere else. But one of the crimes that really caught my eye was the 1933 Twin Cities kidnapping of Ham's beer magnate, William Ham, Jr. The perp was one Alvin Karpus, who had a rap sheet a mile long. However, he also had a sensitive side that Ham saw during his captivity while he was awaiting payment of a $100,000 ransom. Karpus made a point of treating Ham like a house guest by offering him a beer from his refrigerator. But the cold-blooded Karpus was embarrassed to discover that he didn't have any Ham's beer on hand. So he took the brand he had, soaked the label off, and told Ham it was his brewery's beer. After taking a few swigs, Ham thanked Karpus for indeed serving him his beer. Of all the places in America that I approached Sodom and Gomorrah, you have to say that your sacred St. Paul was pretty close to the top of the list. According to the aforementioned Karpus, according to the book, who was a pretty good memoirist as well as a hospitable kidnapper, St. Paul was home to any criminal of any importance in the 1930s. Among its more nefarious characters was the Madam Nina Clifford, who ran one of the more prominent bordellos in St. Paul and was frequented by the region's most elite gentlemen. But Madam Clifford also ran a low-end bordello across town that catered to the lumberjacks. And apparently this was a much more modest facility, perhaps maybe kind of the Walmart of the bordello world. I'm not quite sure how to think about it, but that's sort of by comparison. Now, there was an archaeological dig done on the site of the high-end bordello in 1997. And the scientists determined that Madam Clifford was a strong advocate of local food, having found that all the beer was from a neighborhood brew pub, and the house's poultry was raised on the property. The evidence strongly suggests that this was the first site of Minnesota's first farm-to-bordello program. It's all right here. I'm not making it up. All right, I think I have more to do than just relate your own history to you. You probably don't talk about it a lot, I'm sure, I understand. I'm here to talk about food, and I'm here to talk about it because food is indeed a big deal. How big was adequately captured, in my opinion, by the late, great Kurt Vonnegut, who said, "Take it from someone who's been around 1,000 years, food is pretty much the whole story all the time." My task today, and I'll call it my passion, and I hope that you make it your passion as well, is to explore how we can ensure access to the best and healthiest food for all. And I'll say that in order to achieve this challenging but morally necessary goal, it will require a lot of innovation, collaboration, and leadership represented by the people and the programs that are here today. It will require a more aggressive and more skillful management with public policy. And it will require not only an attention to the complexities and the intricacies of your own food programs, it will require a considerable amount of attention and focus on issues that lie just outside of your day-to-day work. And I'll discuss those in a moment. The challenges before us are a good part of the reason that food has become such a big deal. Because not only is food access a problem for lower income communities, it's fast becoming a problem we all will face. Climate change is responsible for producing unpredictable crop yields, which increase food prices and truncate supply. Over 60% of the U.S. experienced drought conditions in 2012, the worst since 1954. Agricultural pollution of our waterways and the overuse of antibiotics in livestock are threatening both our food supply as well as our public health. Global population is expected to reach 9 billion people by 2050, and many agronomists don't think we have the resources to feed them. Obesity and diet-related illnesses will eat this nation from within if not brought under control. The CDC, for instance, estimates that 1/3 of Americans will be diabetic by 2050. Indeed, the leading reason for rejection from the U.S. military is now obesity. Now, I'm an ardent fan of world peace, but becoming too fat to fight is not the way to achieve it. Obesity has been aided and abetted by the emergence of food deserts and food swamps. 23.5 million Americans, according to the USDA, almost half of whom are lower income, are adversely affected by food deserts and food swamps. Nearly 50 million Americans are food insecure, and we have a record number, 48 million of people participating in the SNAP program. It's now costing $78 billion a year. And political upheaval around the world, which is often associated with weak democracy, food scarcity, and high food prices, is becoming more common. Just look at the Middle East. For these reasons and more, we're witnessing an outbreak of food citizenship, as demonstrated by a crescendo of people clamoring for changes in food and farm policy at local, state, and national levels of government. By way of example, my own local newspaper in Santa Fe, New Mexico, has been filled for the past 2 months with angry letters about a funky urban farm that was shut down because it didn't have the right city permits. Media ink has been flowing about attempts in 30 states to label genetically engineered food over the past several months. And while the New York Times gave front-page billing to a story that highlighted a slight reduction in obesity rates, its editorial page railed against the lunatic asylum that we call the U.S. House of Representatives for stripping the food stamp program from the Farm Bill. The hunger of the overfed and the hunger of the underfed cry out for our attention daily. The perils of global food insecurity and the limits to our Earth's natural resources rarely escape our notice. And the media and our everyday discourse carries unending reminders that our existence rests on shifting sands. As Langston Hughes poetically observed, "I am the people, humble, hungry, mean, hungry yet today, despite the dream." As a result of these circumstances, I feel a compelling need for citizens like you and the people you work with to participate in shaping the food systems in ways that go beyond simply how you spend your food dollars. I feel a need made palpable by events both natural and man-made to call on the latent strengths of communities to take charge of their own destinies. Having effective projects like the ones you run are absolutely necessary for food system change. Being a good food consumer demonstrates individual responsibility. But like water that's purified as it passes through a large biomass, our food system will be enriched by the hands of millions of citizens participating and practicing their God-given right to democratic participation. To this end, cities and countries are developing long-term food strategies and food plans, writing food charters like the one you have underway right here in Minnesota. London has a food strategy. New York City has a policy platform called FoodWorks. Australia is engaged in the development of a national food plan. Edmonton, Alberta, just in the north, right? I think, maybe further west, I'm not sure, I gotta look at a map. Edmonton, Alberta has committed $1 million to a process that engaged over 3,000 citizens in developing a food plan. On one occasion, over 700 Edmonton residents turned out at a public hearing on just one component of that food plan. And just last month, over 1,000 New York City residents came to that city's first ever political food forum to hear what the mayoral candidates think about food policy. I'm impressed with that kind of turnout and the kind of interest that citizens are showing right now in our policy and holding our elected officials accountable. What this organized commitment to food planning represents is a kind of communal responsibility taking, a recognition that we all have a stake in our food system. Within local and state jurisdictions, we have passed or now have pending thousands of bills and other policy-related initiatives that have done everything from allowing for the backyard raising of chickens and bees, to bringing more locally grown food to our public schools, to labeling genetically engineered food, to regulating the location and offerings of fast food restaurants. Because citizens have become engaged, we now have 8,000 farmers markets in this country, 15,000 public schools now operating farm-to-school programs in all 50 states, 200 food hubs, and over 200 local and state food policy councils. I got a look at just how some of these things come together last month in San Bernardino County in California. A 28 farmer food hub is selling 5,000 boxes of produce a week to 23 school districts in Southern California with a combined school population of 1.5 million. That includes the LA Unified School District with over 600,000 students. A nonprofit organization in the community and as part of the food hub donates surplus produce to a food bank. It runs a 1,200-member CSA, which is very accessible to lower-income families, and it offers a very popular food and nutrition education program in the county's schools. A new food policy council has also been established in San Bernardino, and it's taking on the protection of farmland, reducing food insecurity, and preventing obesity. It's an example of the kind of integration that can go on with food projects for business operations, public sector, and nonprofit sector. And I'm sure you have good models of that here in Minnesota as well. I think the more that we can do to explore the link between food access and public policy, the better. More public policy that works on behalf of economically disadvantaged people and communities is the best tool we have to level the marketplace's playing field. I don't care what they say, the marketplace doesn't work real well all the time for everybody. It's the reason you have public policy, is to intervene to create a level playing field. Because if it's not level, it always tips in the direction of the wealthy, no matter what. And I learned this the hard way. After knocking myself out to establish farmers markets in low-income neighborhoods at the rate of maybe 1 or 2 a year when I was working in Hartford, Connecticut, I began advocating for the state to start the farmers market nutrition program to enable lower-income people to participate more easily in farmers markets. From the first market that we started in 1978, Connecticut now has 130 markets. Without policy interventions, we never would have reached that number, nor would we have ever reached the state's most vulnerable populations with that locally grown food. Cleveland, Ohio is typical of many cities where the Food Policy Council made changes in the city's zoning code that expedited the development of urban gardening and farming, allowed for the backyard raising of chickens and bees, that's a popular topic these days, and gave preference to the region's farmers for food purchased by public institutions. Food became a central feature of a much larger Healthy Cleveland initiative. Now, as much as we need to create new and positive directions for our food systems, these kinds of alternatives that engage both the private and the public sector, we also have to take positions to oppose directions that are not healthy. Cleveland, again, tried to ban, as part of its Healthy Cleveland initiative, tried to ban trans fats the way that New York City did a few years ago in restaurants. The food industry fought back by going to the governor, who attached a preemption bill at the last minute to Ohio's state budget bill. This took away the authority of the state's cities to make regulations with respect to food ingredients. The food industry, and many of its players are certainly going to be strong advocates of a healthy and affordable food system, but there are times when they do not work in the public interest, and that was one of those times. Food advocates have to be vigilant with threats to our food sovereignty and our democracy, our right as individuals and as locales to make our own decisions about our food system. I believe that is a right and not one that can be preempted by those who have an extraordinary amount of power and wealth. But we must also engage the economic injustices that underlie many facets of our food system. Consider our food chain workers who pick, process, and prepare our food. They make up 15% of the US workforce. That's the largest single occupational category. They have a median wage of only $9.65 an hour, and only 13% receive a living wage, considerably higher than a minimum wage or considerably higher than $9.65 an hour. 83% of them have no health insurance, and 79% don't get paid sick days. And as you might imagine, the vast majority of these workers are people of color. We depend on them for our survival, yet they are paid so little, they are eligible for food stamps 1.5 times more than other workers. This is but one feature of America's single greatest socioeconomic travesty, the yawning gap between the affluent and everyone else. Because the top 1% of the income earners in the US control over 25% of the wealth, compared to 10% in 1973, everyone in this room has to work a little harder to try to make up and address those disparities. It is why, according to the Institute of Medicine, that among the 17 most developed nations in the world, Americans have the lowest life expectancy and the highest poverty rate. It is why, in part, we have the second highest rate of heart disease and the highest rate of diabetes. And it is why, when I interviewed a county food stamp director in New Mexico, I was told that food stamp applications were soaring, even though the official unemployment rate was only 2%. Why, I asked? Because the county's biggest employers were large big box stores. If you think that our nation's food desert problems will be solved by big box stores, think again. According to the Associated Press, Walmart has threatened to renege on its commitment to build 6 new stores in lower-income Washington, D.C. neighborhoods if the city passes a living wage bill that would bring the minimum wage up to $12.50 an hour. Anybody who's spent any time in Washington knows that you have a hard time living in that city for $12.50 an hour. I happen to believe that not only would hunger virtually disappear if all Americans earned a living wage, I happen to believe that food deserts would begin to disappear as well. Thank you. Getting behind a new minimum wage for this country is essential. Of $10.10 an hour is what's being proposed in Congress. Not enough, but I think a really big step in the right direction. That would immediately lift 3.5 million Americans out of poverty and place less demand on overburdened and underfunded social programs. There is a fragile link between healthy economies, human health, and food sufficiency. As we've seen time and again across America over the past 3 or 4 decades, the collapse in manufacturing and other good-paying jobs portends a collapse in the local economy, followed by a disintegration of community and an unraveling of social ties. I have seen how strong social capital can provide a level of community resilience that buffers economic downturns and enables people to take better advantage of available services, like some of the ones you offer. The growing body of evidence on social capital and community resilience teaches us that successful delivery of services and response to emergency situations are highly dependent on communication, neighbors knowing neighbors, and trustworthiness. Just ask the people facing the wrath of Hurricane Sandy on Staten Island who the so-called first responders were. It wasn't the publicly financed institutions that pulled them from the rising floodwaters, it was their neighbors. Like the cavalry, our public institutions eventually arrive on the scene to help rebuild those communities. But it will be the underlying ties that bind people together that will determine how successful that response is and how successful that rebuilding is. Food programs like the ones you run do and can build social capital. They do and can strengthen communities. And until the cavalry arrives, they do and can rebuild economies that have been undermined by capital flight. However, they are not the answer to an economy that has been dumbed down by big box stores or a national income gap that is the embarrassment of the developed world. We must continue to energize our food programs and use all available resources as imaginatively as possible, and I know you're doing that. But we have to keep our eyes fixed on the big problems of the day and use our voices to demand structural changes in our economy. Now, when gazing across the American landscape, the simple but unavoidable solutions appear to be these. If you want to feed the hungry, tax the rich and mandate a living wage. If you want to expand the economy, strengthen the social fabric of communities and protect the environment. Invest in the sustainable and regional food and farming. And if you want to reduce obesity and diet-related diseases, you're going to have to regulate the food industry. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But how do you make this change happen? Yes, we develop projects like you have that model the way. We formulate policies that make those projects more prevalent, distribute benefits more equitably, and restrict the abuses of the free market. But we need leadership. We need it from individuals. We need it from organizations, and we need it from government and business as well. Over the course of 40 years of community and policy work, I've often reflected on what makes change occur. What mix of human ingredients and institutional action catalyzes life-enhancing change? And the inescapable conclusion I've come to is that it is individuals, sometimes alone and sometimes in small groups, who challenge the status quo, sometimes politely and sometimes less so. In one way or another, they defy fate. They don't accept the standard bureaucratic or political excuses, and they find a way to release a voice that has been long repressed. Now, Ralph Waldo Emerson, whom I lean on the way a drunk leans on a lamppost, said that society is in conspiracy against the personhood of every one of its members. The centuries are conspirators against the sanity and authority of the soul, your soul. He urged us to affront and reprimand the smooth mediocrity and squalid contentment of the times. In my book, Food Rebels, Guerrilla Gardeners, and Smart Cookin' Mamas, I chronicled the actions of local food system leaders who found the voice they needed to affront the smooth mediocrity of the times, because to not affront it would mean the preservation of a debilitating status quo. There was Maurice Small, who grew up in Cleveland's housing projects, and Dorothy Morrison, who still lives in the housing projects of Austin, Texas. Neither one has succumbed to what could have been his or her fate. Tired of seeing the same vacant lots in the city as an adult that he saw as a child, Maurice set out to put his hands in the soil in the same way that his father did. He became comfortable with his own brand of non-conforming, rugged urban individualism and transferred that confidence, that individual confidence, to others in the community. Gardens grew, but more importantly, so did the community's self-esteem. Taking an even stonier path to self-reliance, Dorothy knew hunger as a child, succumbed early to single motherhood and 5 children, but refused to stew in her poverty or accept the cards her fate had dealt her. Through community service and ultimately mastering her food skills and learning to improve her family's health, she began to take charge of her life and play an even greater role in helping her peers. Like Maurice, she found an inner strength from a quiet, spiritual voice inside her. Neither one of these did this as an up-by-your-bootstraps kind of effort, though that was critical. They had a tremendous amount of institutional support, agency support, community support along the way that made a big difference. I also think of the kind of leadership that a business rooted in a community can bring to difficult situations. The kind of leadership I'm thinking of is embodied by the Hanover, New Hampshire Co-op. Founded in 1936 and having established a solid track record for operating a quality, member-owned supermarket, Hanover intervened to take over a failed independent grocer in a nearby lower-income community. In spite of the high risk associated with reopening the store in that area, the co-op's leadership saw an opportunity to sell high-quality food at reasonable prices to people who needed both. Jobs were saved, the market for locally produced food was expanded, and the people's food dollars stayed in the community. While some of the co-op's members objected to using their financial resources for a risky proposition, after all, they argued, we could use that money to lower our own food prices. The leadership convinced the members that not only was this a good business decision, it was also a good moral decision. Since so much of the work these days is conducted in small groups and in coalition with other groups, we need to pay special attention to what makes them effective. Now, there's many books on this subject. I happen to enjoy one called Extraordinary Groups, which found that high-performing groups exhibit a compelling purpose that inspires its members, shared leadership that encourages members to take mutual responsibility. Extraordinary groups embrace differences and cultivate unexpected learning. They strengthen relationships between group members. They promote full engagement that results in all members jumping in with enthusiasm. I can say with little doubt that groups I've worked with where enthusiasm was low also had low results. I would say as well that high-performing groups and individuals value innovation over conformity. They foster an environment of initiative-taking, and they put the success of the shared purpose of the group ahead of that of any of the group's individual members. I think that is the true meaning of partnership and the true meaning of collaboration. Yes, we all share the risk. We will give up a little something and make an investment as well for the good of the group because we will all succeed together. Now, I think there's a parallel here in the food world and food policy in particular. The Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen discovered after a lifetime of researching political economies world resources, poverty, and famine, that no major famine has occurred in a functioning democracy with regular elections, opposition parties, basic freedom of speech, and a relatively free media, even when the country was very poor. In other words, where citizens were engaged, where democracy was working, and where transparency exists, people and their governments will be able to solve their food and health problems. Now, the example I give after thinking about this, that it seemed to apply to developing nations, perhaps less than the United States, was that in fact it does apply just as much here as anywhere else. When I was working in Hartford, Connecticut, and I was a member of the the Hartford Food Policy Council, we discovered one day from among our members that our WIC population, our women, infant, and children population, had plunged from 10,000 people down to 6,000 people in only 1 month. We weren't sure why until somebody told us that one of the WIC clinics had been closed by the city because of a small building repair problem. The city was in no rush to reopen the clinic, but as a result, all the people who went there just disappeared. They had no idea where to go. They had no information. Nobody told them a thing. And so the caseload plunged. Well, as a Food Policy Council, we were justifiably angry. We went to the mayor. We went to the city manager. We went to members of the city council and said, if you don't reopen this clinic very soon, we are going to go to the press. Yes, we will work with you. We will work with you and try to find solutions to reopen this clinic, but you have to take the initiative and get this done. That clinic was reopened in 2 weeks, and the caseload was restored to its full level within a month. This is the kind of action that you all need to take. You need to be paying attention all the time about what's going on in your community. You are the food experts in your place, and it is your job to raise issues that you don't think are being addressed well. My ability to be an effective leader, whether as an individual or with a group, is highly associated in that sense with transparent practices, shared information, and good communication. There's no real substitute. There's no real magic for good leadership. You don't have to read a dozen books to learn how to be a good leader in that respect. It really comes down to basic human instinct and communication. But regardless of how well we practice our leadership skills, we all know that change does not come easily. I'm sure you know that. I've been at this for a long time, and that's why I have gray hair. Change doesn't come easily. All institutions, private and public, nonprofit or for-profit, are by nature conservative. And I don't mean politically. I mean in the traditional sense of the word, whereby they are committed to preserving the status quo. We all do that, all the time. Such people are like the old Connecticut farmer I once knew, who upon giving me a tour one day of his fields, turned to me and said, "Mark, you know, the corn don't grow so good around the edges. So this year I ain't planting any edges." Though I knew this old codger loved to pull my leg, I sensed as well a parable in the making. If we don't work those edges of our lives where things are not safe and predictable, then we'll never grow. We must push outward. We must plant those edges. We must seek change. As in nature, institutions, organizations, and even individuals that don't adapt to changing conditions inevitably decompose and ultimately collapse. I've been engaged in food system work now for 40 years, and I can assure you, communities that don't plan for the future of their food system will be at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Communities that don't take food policy seriously will forfeit the public interest to an ever-shrinking band of private interests. And communities that don't foster a sense of shared leadership and transparent action will be victims of demagoguery and greed. Those who take food for granted not only run the risk of watching their people's health and economies decline, they miss the joy and vibrancy that food, community, and land bring to us all. In light of the challenges facing our globe, We must develop new standards of community wealth that prize health, sustainability, democracy, and justice over the booby prizes of American commercialism. It will not be the size of the estate we bequeath to our children that matters, or that widescreen TV slung from the living room wall that they'll remember. It will be the legacy of healthy bodies, clean air and water, and resilient communities that our children will treasure. None of you can be denied the right to build a food system that's healthy and just. You can't be turned back from the simple democratic notion that you have the freedom to shape your food system. Speak up, be smart, get loud, and stick together. I can assure you, you'll win. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I believe I'm supposed to take questions, as long as they're nice questions, because you are nice people. But I guess we need microphones so we can have good communication. Anybody want to say? You don't have to ask a question. You can say something. You can say I'm full of cheese, whatever. Yes. We have how many takers? I can't see out there.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for your eloquent remarks. I'm wondering if I'm someone that needs to hear things a couple of times, and in the middle of your remarks, you provided a short list that was very succinct, saying, here's really what you need to focus on. And my notes included reforming the tax structure, addressing wages. You had a nice list of a few things. And I'm wondering, first of all, if you could repeat that list. And second of all, if you could describe a little bit how food policy councils at a more local or regional scale and a state level can think about the role they can play in helping advance that agenda that you provided.
Sure. My speech self-destructs when I'm done, so I can't find anything. But I think it was that, yes, taxes, living wages. We need to invest in a sustainable food system. We need to invest in our farming economies. We don't do that. I mean, I think we don't invest in food in the way that we need to. We're just starting to, but we haven't really jumped into that in the way that we have jumped into perhaps other areas. Well, I think there is still a tremendous amount of opportunity within local areas, within regions, to be able to improve the operation of our food systems. I use the Food Hub as one example, where they are growing quite rapidly. The one in San Bernardino has actually, with 28 farmers, for instance, participating in that. That's an investment that's been made in their food system. It's being supported, in effect, indirectly, by public purchases, namely through Farm to School. But it is the reason, according to the farmers I spoke to, it is the reason that they are still in business and that land is still there and they are still a vital part of that community. And the third thing I said was that we need to regulate the food industry. There's not enough evidence to show that voluntary measures are going to be enough to turn around the severity of the obesity problem in this country. Whether we're going to significantly reduce advertising, unhealthy food advertising, especially that directed at children. It's still in the billions of dollars per year category. Whether we're going to begin to push back at the food industry, rather at the fast food industry that wants to keep pushing itself into every facet of our lives. I think we have to take much more aggressive action. And I'm not sure there's an easy answer other than a more aggressive role on the part of city and state and federal agencies. With respect to food policy councils, I am going to be doing a session on that early this afternoon. But I think the areas where I've seen them be most effective is in actually increasing food access. There's been a lot of work done to make connections between different parts of the food system. One big example is just making EBT more prevalent at farmers markets, because they actually go and they get the Department of Agriculture and the Department of, say, Social Services or Human Services, whoever runs the food stamp program, gets them together and along with the private sector and farmers markets to try to figure out how to make that happen. They're investing money in the development of new food retail outlets. I mean, not the food policy councils, but they're advocating for that kind of policy intervention. They have done things like eliminate or ban trans fats in restaurants under their jurisdictions. There's a long list of activities, but I think increasingly we're seeing food policy councils, get organized, figure out that they need to be multi-stakeholder type organizations. They have to work in partnership with the public sector and the private sector, and they're beginning to learn how to apply the policy options and interventions to improve their own communities. And it often starts with simply knowing their community well. I mean, that can be their own sort of basic knowledge, but it also comes from conducting food assessments, so that they really understand what's going on and what might be the most appropriate interventions. But more on that later. Other questions or comments?
Good morning, Mark. Thank you for
Where are
coming
you?
to Minnesota.
Yeah.
In your work, small town America is dependent upon oftentimes a single owner-operated kind of grocery store that has many products in addition to food, toothpaste and whatnot. Do you have any ideas about policy to support those businesses and help them convert to a local food source option? I'm understanding that oftentimes insurance is a barrier, and also that their food suppliers, I've had small grocers say if they don't sell a certain volume, their food supplier will not continue to support their store, and many small towns need this food source.
Mm-hmm. You're asking, how can you help
What
food
kind of
retailers use more locally produced
Yes.
food?
Yes.
Well, I think I'm not sure I have a lot of good answers on that. I mean, I know that a lot of people are figuring that out. I don't think there's any yes, I mean, buying enough, working with someone who will aggregate that supply so that a small store owner who doesn't have a lot of volume could still take advantage of price savings and access to locally produced food. We have sometimes larger co-ops have actually played that role. Sometimes, like the group I just described in California, acts as a food hub. There's basically ways you might say, to kind of circumvent the traditional distribution lines. Sometimes it does take more aggressive action on the part of policy. We're seeing this in New Mexico, where the state has been stepping up to support a number of initiatives to promote local agriculture, because they see a value in looking at local agriculture, what it can produce economically for the state, and what it can do with regard to health. So we're making those connections within the state. And it's taken a long time to convince people that this is what, convince policymakers that this is what needs to happen, that there are benefits, economic benefits associated with that. So I think it's a combination of, sort of that reinventing that entrepreneurism that begins to figure out how you can solve distribution problems at the same time and there's good technical assistance available on that nationwide. The Wallace Center is one example. But also how you can use policy as well to try to kind of connect the dots.
Over here. Hi.
Hi.
Tracy Sides
I
from
forgot my sunglasses, so I'm sorry.
Tracy Sides from the east side of St. Paul, and I really appreciated your comments and the multifaceted lens that you brought to the topic. I'm very compelled by the idea of empowering individuals, but also organizations at the community level, and am very intrigued by an innovative funding mechanism that several of us in the room here actually are part of. The St. Paul Foundation has a $1 million grant out there, and they've solicited ideas from the community. They got almost 1,000 of them. Wow. And then a community panel took that down to 30, and then a 9-person judge took that down to 3 finalists. And a team of us are fortunate enough to be one of those finalists.
Wow.
And public voting throughout Minnesota will actually decide which of those ideas will win. It's the impact, or the place it'll happen is right in St. Paul. And ours is the only food-related one, and it is to create a signature food hub in this nature sanctuary that's situated right next to downtown and in my neighborhood of the East Side, which is very economically and culturally diverse. And so it was really affirming to hear you, your words, because it was encouraging to what we're doing. I do want to encourage everyone to vote for food by texting the word food to 228-466. But I do actually have a point related to what you're talking about, Mark. And that is, what role do you think that these sorts of innovative funding mechanisms that can really tap into the collective wisdom of communities to pull out those solutions that are living there for the community's needs?
So, in other words, putting together a decent-sized pot of money that is targeted toward some innovative form of community development and
right, yeah, that really draws
has an entrepreneurial part to it as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, and kind of like what you're talking about, really draws from the community knows itself, and
Absolutely.
So.
Well, I think the more of that we can do, the better. I can't think of any reason not to. I mean, it certainly should be, I think, targeted. That sounds like a pretty aggressive and competitive campaign to kind of winnow down the, that large pool of ideas down to something that's practical. Of course, that's necessitated, I'm sure, by, not that $1 million doesn't necessarily go that far. But I think the more of that we can do, the better. I think the more I'm seeing more foundations do that kind of work. I'm seeing more foundations actually coming together in these convergences to fund and support like 1 or 2 areas of interest at a time, rather than like go all over the map. They're looking at. I think what we're seeing is a number of things like social enterprises, trying to understand that social enterprise, we don't have to be either for-profit or non-profit. We can be somewhere in the middle. That makes sense. Foundations are not as scared of policy work as they used to be. That they can support efforts that are going to, hold the public sector accountable. So I think the more of that we can do, the better. I was in England a couple of months ago, where they have a $2 million comes out to $2 million of funding to support the development of food policy councils all over the country. And this is actually coming from their private sector, from foundations and their equivalent of nonprofit organizations. So that kind of targeted, focused effort is a good idea, rather than, I found myself over the years chasing grant opportunities all over the place, and trying to fit my, a foundation says they're going to support this kind of thing, and so I try to figure out how to sound like that kind of thing, and I'm always finding myself being a square peg in a round hole. Sometimes I'm clever enough to make them believe that I'm really going to do that. Other times I fail. But I think we have to stop playing that game, and I think that kind of focused giving and it's different. It's a great new future. It's a future in that way. I think that we hear from the communities, and here's what they want. That's a whole lot better than hearing from a few, nonprofit organizations that think they have all the answers, which they do sometimes. Let's see, what do we got? Maybe one more. How long? What's the?
Excuse me, if you don't mind, can we have her repeat the text number again?
Thank you. So just text the word food to the number 228-466.
Anyone else?
And we do have a 3-minute video about our idea. We'll show it at the Twin Cities Regional Breakout.
So if nobody else asks me a question, we're going to keep hearing advertisements.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
I am just curious what your experience has been, and if you have any advice for sort of navigating the perils of GMO when it comes to food access and to food policy. You know, it's a sticky wicket. I work for the Minnesota Farmers Market Association, and even though so many of our board members feel really strongly about GMO, is it, you know, it's not exactly a black and white issue to everyone. Any comments you could have would be great.
Yeah, good. I'm up to my elbows in alligators on GMOs. Not so much by choice. I just found myself getting caught up in all that. This is where you want to be brave and go up against the forces of darkness and evil, and then you find that that's really not very wise, and not only are you going to lose, but you're going to get beat up along the way, and then you try to make everybody happy, and that's impossible as well. So I found, I'll just use this example in New Mexico, because I think it's actually a fairly good illustration, is that we had a bill come before our state legislature this past session to label GMOs in the state of New Mexico. It has 2 million people. How anybody would label food just coming into New Mexico is beyond me, but that was the bill. It was roadkill. I mean, we're a big ag state, more or less, and those folks didn't like it, and it was summarily executed within 1 week of its appearance. And that angered a lot of the advocates for GMOs. I mean, they felt really put out, just angry, and they decided to then go to the cities. In this case, they went to Santa Fe, and they said, we want to label food that's sold in Santa Fe, which is even more ridiculous since we have about 60,000 people. And how are we going to label food that just comes into Santa Fe from Kellogg and from all over the world? So we have a food policy council, and this was our strategy. We said, all right, we know there's not a practical way to label all this food. And then they wanted to actually ban the production. They wanted to ban the use of seed that was GMO seed. Any farmer within Santa Fe County would not be able to use GMO seed as well, which would provoke a huge backlash on the part of farmers. So we have introduced a resolution after a great deal of research, actually, really looked at this question carefully, and we heard from all sides. And we came up with what we feel is a fairly unique idea, which is a fairly aggressive education strategy, whereby the city and the county are going to take responsibility and work with cooperative extension, hopefully, to try to provide information about GMOs. Not a mandatory labeling program, but really more of a sort of a public education process that would include public forums and be fairly open and hear from all sides, and that we, at the same time, we're going to be educating consumers, we're also going to be educating the farmers. So we're using that approach, which we think is a way to keep the debate going and give people the information they need to make choices, try to provide models. We have a Whole Foods we have 2 Whole Foods in Santa Fe. They're leading the way nationally on a labeling program. That might be a model for some of our more conventional stores. We did hear one concern, which was, the elite places like Whole Foods are going to label things, and that's great for that crowd who shop there. But what about all the people that shop at the mainline conventional supermarkets? Those places aren't going to jump on that bandwagon. But we think that through this sort of more gentle educational approach, we might convince conventional supermarkets to at least provide some point of purchase information, something on their sites. We're actually finding that they're putting up information on their websites about organic food and local food. Well, they might be able to also put up information about GMOs. So that's our strategy. We'll see if it works. But I do think that it's the choice between that and undertaking, full-level warfare with the industry, with Monsanto, is going to be a real tough battle. You saw what happened in California. They spent $45 million to kill Proposition 37, and I'm not sure Now, I will say also that I'm proud that I'm from Connecticut, And Connecticut is the first state to actually have a legislative mandate for labeling genetically engineered food. However, there's a lot of conditions attached to that, and I don't know if the state will be able to meet those conditions. So anyway, I could go on about this forever, and I'm not going to. But thank you for the
I have
question.
a question right here. So over the last 5 years, more or less, I would say, there's been this shift within the food movement towards, well, a lot of people here and around the country are talking about a food justice movement. And that's caused a lot of turmoil in some of the larger organizations with this call for more equity and inclusiveness, and has led to the demise of some of these larger organizations, which I don't think is really serving anyone's, the larger food movement. I don't think that's serving our interests. And so I guess with you talk about the inherent conservativeness of all organizations and entities and agencies. I guess my question for you is, how do you think we can shift some of the organizations and groups that have built up around the food movement to be more equitable and inclusive without tearing them apart in the process?
Mm-hmm. So you're saying some of the larger ones have folded because
Yeah.
because of this
Yes.
question of, because they haven't been able to deal with the question of equity and social justice very well?
Yeah, I think it's a significant challenge.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting. I think there's not going to be an easy alternative to, say, people like you just raising the question with those groups and saying this is what we really believe. And I have one example from it was a big food bank, one of the largest food banks in the country. I spoke at it was like their 30th anniversary. And I was really kind of shocked to see that the whole leadership of the food bank had been there forever. They were the founding people. They'd been there for 30 plus years. They were as old as me. And then all the kind of line staff were like about your age. And while on one hand, I'm talking to how the people in the leadership of the food bank wanted to just keep doing things the way they'd been doing and building a bigger and bigger food bank, the younger people were very much like asking questions about social justice, about sustainability, about whether or not this was the right approach at all to addressing poverty and hunger and so forth. And they started asking those questions of the leadership and started to become more aggressive in that way. And I think to the credit of the leadership, they were resilient enough and smart enough to be open to listen and have a good back and forth, have a good robust debate over it. And I think that's what's going to be necessary. Keep doing that. Keep bringing up those issues. Keep talking about it. Be mildly annoying. That's usually what I tell people. Be mildly annoying, and you'll be surprised what can happen over time. And don't give up. All right? I'm done, according to the man up here, and we have a very attractive woman who's going to be coming up after me, so I think that's great. Thanks very much.